The embarrassment is compounded when anti-evolutionists are called upon to explain how a single flood could sort out the isotopes of argon, lead, uranium, strontium, potassium, and rubidium in such a way that each layer appears just a little bit older than the one above it. Flood geology was abandoned by geologists over 100 years ago, and subsequent discoveries make it less attractive today than it was in the last century. Science offers a more plausible rationale for the appearance of the Earth today than does flood geology. Let's take a quick look at the next sequence of slides. This is the beginning of Wegener's hypothesis of continental drift. Now, this was proposed over 50 years ago and very largely rejected. But by the processes of science, they continued to investigate the problem, and more data arose to vindicate Wegener. And today, we go through these. I don't know which one is on there now, but that's 200 million years ago. Let's take a look at the next one, which is 180 million years ago, and then 135 million years ago, which is the next one, and finally 65 million years ago, showing how the planet has changed in plate tectonics theory, which accounts for so many of the Earth's features of the past and present. Now, this is a far more plausible scientific explanation of how the Earth came to be than is flood geology. Now, Dr. Gish is invoking the second law of thermodynamics to make evolution an impossibility is in error. And I believe Dwayne knows that it's in error. Let's take a look at this for a moment. We don't have a time for a seminar on thermodynamics. Can we have the next slide? There we are. This is the creation model. And by the way, whenever you see the term model, you know you're talking to a creationist. Creationists don't use the term theory, they use the term model. The creation model, and then they have to reduce the evolution theory to a model. But this is it, a very depressing piece of information which indicates we are bound on an inexorable course of destruction and decreasing order, which Dr. Gish has already illuminated for you. So this is what the creationist point looks like, because it's taken from a creationist document. And they say that nothing can go against the inexorable flow postulated by the second law of thermodynamics, and this just isn't true. Let's look at the other slide that they propose. This is, as I say, the evolution model. Now, if I had my choice, I'd pick this one, because at least it's going uphill. Now, unfortunately, that isn't what evolution says. Darwin himself, in his writings, indicated that evolution was not a progression to perfection. But anyhow, in any situation where energy is provided from the outside, the creationist interpretation of the second law is invalid. And the fact that each of you is sitting there is the greatest refutation of this argument that can be made. If you take Dr. Gish's concept seriously, when a human egg is fertilized, it must disintegrate, because it can't go counter to entropy. But it does, as Gish indicates. It takes in energy and it grows into an organism of trillions of specialized cells. It goes from disorder to order. It goes from simple to complex. It goes exactly the opposite way that Gish says it can go. As Gish views the second law of thermodynamics, you shouldn't be sitting there. Now, the reason Gish gets by with this is most people don't have the slightest idea what it is the second law of thermodynamics does say. But let me assure you that it doesn't prevent you from developing from a single fertilized egg. The second law of thermodynamics indicates that without energy, things go from order to disorder. If you let your watch run down, the kind of watch I have that doesn't run with a battery, it runs down, but I can add energy by winding it, and it goes again. So if you provide energy, you can delay disorder. The second law of thermodynamics also says you can't transfer heat from a cold body to a hot one, but that's not germane to this particular issue. But whatever it says, it does not prevent organization from disorder as long as an energy source is present. Now, Dwayne made a very big point of the second law of thermodynamics. I'm not going to be picky enough to tell him that in the creation story that he postulates, creation ex nihilo violates the first law of thermodynamics. Now, whether the first law takes precedence over the second law, I don't know. I just know that it's a red herring. Gish has stated that the first requirement in science is observation, and then says that evolution can't be scientific because nobody was around to observe the origin of the universe or of life. Now, in this statement, Dr. Gish is guilty of misrepresentation. Science, indeed, is based on observation and experiment, but it does not require eyewitnesses to all events. No one, for example, has seen an atom. According to Gish, then, atoms are not scientific and perhaps do not even exist because nobody has seen one. We do, however, see fossils. We note geographic distribution of organisms. We see structure as evidenced in comparative anatomy. We see development as evidenced in embryology. We see and can calculate sedimentation rates. We note erosion. We can observe radiometric decay. We can calculate time. Look at this next slide, which is of a Ptolemaic universe. There we are. Way back, nobody knew there was a planet, Neptune. It was postulated and it was found. And then we didn't know there was a planet, Pluto, but it was postulated and found. Now, these are all observations, and they're as valid as any eyewitness accounts. If creationists want to say that only things that can be seen by eyewitnesses can be classified as observation, then the disciplines of astronomy, chemistry, physics, geology cannot exist, nor indeed can science exist. This parochial and limited interpretation would wipe away most of the world's evidence. All right, thank you. Now, we also discussed probability. And he indicates that probability is a kind of fundamental laws of science. Disraeli, however, had a much better view of the subject when he indicated that there were lies, damned lies, and statistics. Anyone who's had the slightest experience with statistical manipulation knows that you can use it to prove or disprove almost anything. For example, none of you can be here. The fact that any one person on the face of this globe would be here at this time is 1 over 4 billion. The fact that 2 people would be in this room at the same time is 1 over 4 billion times 1 over 4 billion. And carry out this manipulation in the same way that Gish suggested, to encompass the number of individuals in this room, the resulting number is so gargantuan that there's absolutely no chance at all that any of you can be here, for the probability is greater than the number of particles in the universe. You may have heard that before in another connection. The fact that you are here despite statistics, and the fact that you grew up and developed despite the second law of thermodynamics, must indicate something wrong with these representations. Let's very quickly look at the next slide. Now, this is a little game. Would you play a game if only one of those number possible combinations would win? That's worse than the worst odds in Las Vegas. Let's make it a little better. Look at the next one. Now, if we could reduce this by non-randomness, give you a little better odds, would you play now? And the answer, of course not. You'd never win, would you? You know what these are? These are the odds for doing Rubik's Cube that a small child can do in a few minutes. According to these, we can prove the small child can't do it. You must remember that regardless of probability, no matter how gargantuan the number, the chances are equally good that the improbable event will happen the first time as the last. And that there's a 50-50 chance that it will happen before you're halfway through the series. Somehow, looking at these interpretations of figures, I'm reminded of the couple who would have only 3 children because every 4th child born in the world is Chinese. Dr. Gish is frequently fond of speaking of a series of organisms from amoeba to man. Let's take a look at amoeba to man. It says, let's face it, evolution has passed us by, these amoebae are talking, and so it has. Now, as far as the fossil record is concerned, the amazing thing is it's so good and getting better every day with new discovery. Let's take a look at the next slide. The reason Duane bemoans the absence of intermediate forms is he refuses to recognize them. That was it. Whoop. Where'd the yellow one go? Well, we're missing one somewhere. There it is. Some of these youngsters have come up with a terrific new idea, feathers. There's the intermediate between reptiles and birds. Archaeopteryx, if you'd like. The fact is that the fossil record is remarkably complete, and only by deliberately suppressing data or misrepresenting it can the statement be made that the gaps seen in the fossil record fail to support evolutionary phylogeny, when the fossil record delineates an impressive and incontrovertible lineage of organismic change through time. Next slide, please. Well, that isn't the slide I wanted, but you might as well leave it up there. This is just a way to make sure that we keep science and non-science apart. In the fair play argument, Gish has stated that it is urgent to have students exposed to all of the evidence, all of the arguments on each side of the question. Now, I thoroughly agree with this and find it unfortunate that the creationists have not presented all of the evidence or all of the data. Rather, they have misrepresented either deliberately or inadvertently the evidence for evolution and have none of their own to offer in its place. A careful listening to the presentation indicates that 99% of the arguments are straight anti-evolution, apparently under the delusion that if one can deprecate evolution, then they stand in the wings with the only possible alternative scientific hypothesis. So we can leave it at that for the moment. There will be rebuttal time. Thank you.
We will now have a short 10-minute recess. Everyone back in his seat in exactly 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
I'm delighted to stand.
Listen, tell me one thing. First of all, where's the rest?
So we should be out of here in probably an hour and a half at the very outside. All right, we will now hear from Dr. Gish once more.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, you notice that this evening I presented scientific evidences from the science of thermodynamics, from the laws of probability as they relate to the design and purpose that we find in our universe, and the fossil record. I presented scientific evidence that is compellingly in favor of the theory of creation. On the other hand, Dr. Mayer, as I'm sure you have noticed, has presented practically no scientific evidence whatsoever to support evolution. And what little bit of evidence he did present was a disaster. What he has done really has tried to impress upon you that all the scientists believe in evolution. Well, why do most scientists believe in evolution? Because most scientists believe in evolution. But what about the scientific evidence? Well, he talked mainly about dating, which I said was not the issue here tonight, and I wished I had an hour or two to give the evidences, the assumptions, all of these radiometric dating methods. The very validity of the method is totally based upon the assumptions. I wished I had time to list the numerous time clocks which do indicate that things could be very young. But that's not the issue. He talked a lot about the flood. You know, that's rather amazing. He suggested the Grand Canyon could not have formed from a great flood. Well, do you know that on Mars there are geological features, including a vast canyon in which they tell me you could put about 20 Grand Canyons? And you know what people are saying? You know what many geologists are saying? That those geological features on Mars were formed by vast flooding. Now listen. Here on Earth we have 350 million cubic miles of water covering 70% of its surface. Mars does not have one drop of liquid water. Not one drop. And yet they say on Mars, those geological features, vastly greater than the Grand Canyon, could have formed by vast flooding. But they would deny the very possibility here on Earth, which has 350 million cubic miles of water, and Mars doesn't have one single drop. What kind of logic would one have to use to reach such conclusions? Now, Dr. Mayer mentioned probability. Here we are, all in this room. Well, you just calculate the probability. We're all here, and it's impossible, yet here we are. Yes, that's true. If we had to get here by chance, you see, evolution works by chance. Ladies and gentlemen, we did not get here by chance. You did not get here by chance. You saw a notice in the newspaper, heard it on the radio, or saw a poster or something. You took deliberate action to get here into this auditorium. That's why you're here, and that's the only reason you're here. If you had to get here by chance, Dr. Mayer's right, not one of us would be here. But we didn't get here by chance. You see, it's totally, totally irrelevant. And he spoke of the Rubik's Cube. The many different ways in which you can arrange a Rubik's Cube, and yet it can be solved. Of course, by intelligent human beings. But ladies and gentlemen, give a Rubik's Cube to a monkey, and you come out with exactly that probability of him working that Rubik's Cube. Now that's the difference. It's incredible that evolutionists can't see the difference. Evolution is totally chance, you see. We are not chance machines. We are human beings with intelligence. And that's the difference. Incredible that an evolutionist, scientist, cannot discern the difference. What about thermodynamics? Says you shouldn't be here, according to my theory. You see, you started with a little fertilized egg and you end up with a human being with all these trillions of cells, and that goes against the second law. That's a lot of nonsense. I can't understand a scientist would use such an argument. Listen, I have no problem accounting for people as long as we have parents. There's no problem. I can account for babies as long as we start with parents. But you've got to start with that egg. You've got to start with that fertilized egg. You see, that's what he started with, a fertilized egg. But how do you explain the origin of the egg in the first place? You see, that's the problem. The egg would have to generate itself spontaneously with no parents. That's the theory of evolution. You start out with hydrogen gas and you end up with people. You see, that's totally irrelevant. That has nothing to do with this science of thermodynamics. He said, just bring in energy. That's all you need. Was that all you need? Okay. You park your car on the side of a hill. That car suddenly runs uphill all by itself. A clear violation of the second law of thermodynamics. Ladies and gentlemen, that will never happen. And you know it won't. But you can get a car to go uphill without violating the second law of thermodynamics. I'll agree with that. All right, now Dr. Mayer says all you need to do is bring in energy. Okay, let's do that. Let's bring in a can of gasoline, pour it on the car, and light a match. Well, now you know the car's not going to go uphill. It's going to go up in smoke. What do you have to do to get that car to go uphill? You put the gasoline into a gas tank, which is fed into a what? A motor. An energy conversion machine. And that motor has the ability, you see, to convert that chemical energy in the gasoline into mechanical energy. And it can be utilized to drive the car uphill. But you have to have the motor. And furthermore, that machine must be under proper control. Otherwise, it doesn't go uphill, it goes off into the ditch. You see, you have to satisfy certain conditions. If you're going to build up order and complexity and organization, you've got to have not only energy coming in from the outside, you've got to have a proper energy conversion machine and a proper control system. The same is true of green plants. Green plants can take the energy from the sun and convert it into chemical energy. Why? One reason, only because they possess photosynthesis. That's the reason why. But where did that come from in the first place, you see? Could photosynthesis, this incredibly complex system, just generate itself? Now, that's what Dr. Mayer would have you believe. That hydrogen gas just converted itself into all of these green plants and people and everything else. This all started with nothing but hydrogen gas. It all happened spontaneously. Now, that's just nonsense, ladies and gentlemen. That does not happen out there in the real world. Furthermore, if Dr. Mayer believes that all you have to do is bring in energy, and you can construct and maintain order and organization, I have a challenge to Dr. Mayer. If that's all you need. We are open systems. We can take in energy, quite a bit more than we need, as a matter of fact. We can take in energy. We are the most sophisticated machines in the universe. Now, if all you need is an outside supply of energy, that's all you need. That's what he's saying. Okay, Dr. Mayer, I have a challenge for you. Live forever. He can't do it. He can't live forever. Nobody can live forever. Nobody beats the second law of thermodynamics. You and I can't do it because why? We are aging, we are going to die, and we're going to go to a pile of dust. People go to particles, but particles never go to people. You have to start with parents to get people. You see, if this is true, if Dr. Mayer is true, what he's saying, then he could live forever. But that's not possible. The second law is a law that governs this universe. It is telling us that we are going downhill. Everything goes in that direction, and yet, you see, this clock, this universe, supposedly wound itself up. Dr. Mayer said he could wind his watch up. That's true. But a watch cannot wind itself up. But he is telling you that's what the universe did. The universe wound itself up. And life wound itself up. That's not true, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, I understand the second law of thermodynamics. He said that I knew I was deliberately distorting the second law of thermodynamics. I'll let you be the judge, ladies and gentlemen, if you think that charge is true. Totally untrue. Now, he says that science does not actually require observations. You don't see an atom, you don't see an electron. That's true. All right, you don't see God. Then you can believe that God exists. That'd be just as scientific, you see. And you can believe in creation just as well as evolution, if you don't have to see anything. Now listen, we can see the effect of an atom. We can see the effect of the electron. We can measure that effect. We can do it repeatedly. We can actually determine the charge of an electron. We can determine its mass from the repeated observations that we can make. And we can do the same thing as far as creation is concerned, just as much as evolution. To say that evolution is science and creation is not is totally false, ladies and gentlemen. Now, Dr. Mayer said, oh, there's many explanations, that this is a false dichotomy to say there's only creation and evolution. And he said, for example, some people believe that life came from outer space. Well, that's not a new model. You're just transferring the problem to another planet, that's all. Either out there it had to evolve or it had to be created. And he suggests the Hindu, the American Indian, all of that. Those are different explanations. Ladies and gentlemen, they are not. They are either supernatural, theistic explanations, or they are mechanistic, naturalistic explanations. One or the other, I don't care where you got them. I don't care whether Hindu, American Indian, life from space, or whatever. There are only two basic explanations. Either life was created supernaturally or it evolved mechanistically and naturally. And Sir Fred Hoyle and Professor Wickramasinghe say this: wherever life exists in the universe, it had to be created. As a matter of fact, I heard Professor Wickramasinghe say that. He said this is empirical evidence for the existence of God. All right, Dr. Mayer wants empirical evidence. There it is. The empirical evidence for the existence of God, according to Wickramasinghe, who said previously he had been an atheist Buddhist. And I heard him say that too. how it was a compelling nature of the scientific evidence and that won him to the creationist cause. Now, Dr. Mayer mentioned this accumulating evidence. He wants to give us the idea that as time has gone on, Darwinism has become stronger and stronger and stronger. Ladies and gentlemen, just exactly the opposite is true. Dr. Mayer, if you know the mechanism of evolution, I want you to tell this audience. Because no evolutionist today would dare say that he knows what the mechanism of evolution is. Supposedly Darwin had supplied that mechanism. Darwinism is dying. As a matter of fact, Stephen Jay Gould, this professor at Harvard University mentioned by Dr. Mayer, said that this neo-Darwinian theory, the mechanism of evolution, although it's still textbook orthodoxy, it is effectively dead. He doesn't believe in that mechanism. Now, if Dr. Mayer knows the mechanism, tell us, what is the mechanism of evolution? We ought to know. We're 120 years after Darwin. We should have solidified. We should know exactly the mechanism of evolution. They don't know what the mechanism of evolution is. What about this evidence from embryology? Supposed to be the greatest evidence. Darwin said, no greater evidence than evidence from embryology. The idea that a human embryo looks like a fish, and then a tadpole, then a reptile, then an ape, and so forth and so on. That theory is thoroughly discredited. I debated Ashley Montague a few years ago. I made that statement. Dr. Montague said, yes, that is correct. No evolutionist should ever use this idea of embryological recapitulation to support evolution. The human embryo never has gill slits, ladies and gentlemen. That is just sheer nonsense. A human embryo never has slits into the throat. It never has gills. Since it never has gills, it never has slits, obviously it never has gill slits. Just a superficial resemblance that has nothing to do with the truth. And it is known to have been discredited. It is stated in the scientific literature many, many times, and yet it is found in biology books, and I dare say it's probably in the BSCS textbooks that were brought into being by Dr. Mayer and his group. Vestigial organs, I have an article published just recently in an evolutionary journal in which the author said that there is no evidence for evolution from vestigial organs. The so-called vestigial organs, which at one time numbered 200, have now shrunk down to practically zero. There is no evidence at all. These vestigial organs with scientific and medical research have proven to be functional, but the theory of evolution retarded that research for many, many years. Our space program has shown that every planet in the solar system is uniquely different. And that shows it is a manufactured article. It has not evolved from one cloud of dust and gas. The ratio of argon-40 to argon-36 on Venus, for example, is 100 times what it is here on the Earth. And if all of this evolved out of the same cloud of dust and gas, it should be the same. But it is not. As evidence has accumulated, we found this tremendous evidence for complexity in life. We now know that life is vastly more complex than we dreamed even 20 years ago. And that renders even more improbable the possibility that it could have evolved. Colin Patterson, the senior paleontologist at the British Museum that I mentioned earlier, he said that he spoke at the university, at the Field Museum in Chicago. He asked those geologists, tell me, what one thing do you know about evolution? Silence. He went over to the University of Chicago, spoke to the evolution morphology group. He says, tell me, what one thing do you know about evolution? Silence. Finally, one man said, well, I do know this. We shouldn't teach it in high school. Now, if we know all of these marvelous things about evolution, as Dr. Mayer has suggested, then why didn't these people tell Dr. Patterson what they knew definitely about evolution? And Colin Patterson said he neither knew anything about evolution. Thank you.
Now we will have a 15-minute rebuttal from Dr. Mayer. Dr. Mayer.
We hear a lot about chance, as if we took a whole bunch of chemicals and shook them up in a bottle and they could permute into a great variety of forms, substances, etc. It doesn't work by chance, for one thing. Any of you who have ever seen a periodic table of elements knows that these are ordered, serried ranks of materials that combine in certain ways. You may get CH4, but you're not going to get CH7. You're not going to find argon doing much in the way of being active chemically. We're not dealing with a whole universe of things. We're dealing with a relatively small number. The bulk of protoplasm is simply carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Traces of other things, but that's the bulk of it. So that we're not talking about chance. Things happen in certain predictable, preordained ways. Dwayne pointed up earlier very complex molecules and told you how difficult they were to assemble. We're assembling them in laboratories now. We have built complex biological molecules. It can be done. Not by chance. You just don't put a bunch of chemicals in a bottle and shake them. What you do is understand how they go together. It's like a very complex Lego. They fit together in certain ways and not in certain others. There are certain combinations you get. There are certain combinations you don't get. Let's disabuse ourselves of chance. I'm not going to belabor thermodynamics, but there is one thing we can say for sure, that thermodynamics does not inexorably move in one direction, but there are permutations up and down. Mr. Gish discussed embryology and told about Darwin's embryos. Those are nice, but they were Haeckel's embryos, and they do not appear in the BSCS texts, so that we do not have in these books what Dr. Gish alludes to. It's very difficult to deal with all of the evidences for evolution. If you go to your library, there are literally shelf after shelf of books. I thought that Dr. Gish would present positive evidence for creationism. I have heard none. The data for creationism seems to have been presented by me, and the evidence against evolution by Dr. Gish. Whatever we do, we must recognize that we have a great variety of opinions about a number of things. But again, the name of Gould came up. Gould is a confirmed evolutionist. Don't let anybody doubt that. Don't let any out-of-context quote or any comment at variance with the facts influence your knowledge on that one point. You do find Gould an evolutionist. His concern is with mechanism. Dr. Gish's concern was in mechanism. And I wish it were easy to give him a very simple explanation of mechanisms. As we find out more, we find the mechanisms more and more complex. We are now at that stage in our laboratories where we can patent new life forms. We can go into the structure of a cell and give it entirely new instructions to do our bidding. And we can take the resultant to the U.S. Patent Office, and we can get on that a patent. Dr. Gish, very early in his presentation, mentioned kinds. I've been trying for a long time to find out what creationism means by kinds. In the language of science, there are phyla, classes, order, families, genera, species. but not kinds. What are kinds? As I look at the literature of creationism, sometimes kinds are species, sometimes kinds are genera, sometimes kinds are families, sometimes kinds are orders. I don't know what a kind is. I wish it were explained to me. The major thesis is still valid. Evolution is a useful theory that accounts for organismic diversity and relationship, as no other theory does. It is to biology what the theory, the atomic theory, is to chemistry and physics. It is a vast synthetic explanation to account for a wide variety of facts, make them comprehensible, coordinate them, order them into an understandable whole. One of the things that I've run across in dealing with this issue is that so many people think a theory is a guess. You've heard it again and again. Oh, that's only your theory, or that's only theoretical, as if this is simply a random statement picked out of the air. Theory is not that. A theory is a highly substantiated explanation, and there are no other alternatives in biological science that do for biology what the theory of evolution does. There's simply no explanation that brings the discipline together, synthesizes it, accounts for the facts, and makes sense. Now, whether or not this is a position that denigrates creation as seen by Dr. Gish, I really don't know. But I know that for the vast majority of the world's religions, this is not a problem. This is not a problem. I'm reminded of what Galileo said. This wasn't original with Galileo. He was paraphrasing someone else when he said, "Science doesn't teach you how to go to heaven. Science teaches how the heavens go." And there is the difference. If creationism is a valid alternative scientific thesis, then its theories, its hypotheses, its assumptions should be explicable to a scientific audience. And if it is valid, then the names of creationists will go thundering down the corridors of time as upsetting the entire scientific knowledge of the last 2,000 years. The fact that this has not occurred, the fact that we do not find wide acceptance in the scientific community of creationism as science, not creationism. This is not an argument. Gish brings up the denial of a creator. Science is moot on this point. It simply doesn't deal with it. The two-model approach gives you an alternative. You can be a creationist or an evolutionist. And unfortunately, the evolutionist has been described as the Southerner used to describe Yankee. Damn Yankee used to be one word down south, and atheistic evolutionist is frequently one word in the creationist vocabulary. The world is not divided into things that are theistic and atheistic. There are great numbers of non-theistic things. When your car, for example, has trouble, and you take it to a mechanic in a garage, and he says, there's nothing I can do for this, it is God's will, you take it to another mechanic, because you recognize this is not a theistic problem. It's purely a mechanistic problem. To ask that the world be simply divided into theists and atheists is taking too much liberty with the religion of too many people. And it does not account for the fact that in the vast majority of our daily activities, we deal with non-theistic matters. We'll deal with mechanical items, we deal with legal items, we deal with social items, we deal with all kinds of items for which it is not necessary to evoke a theistic, atheistic dichotomy. And I think many scientists deeply resent the implication that if one is not a creationist, one is an atheist. For most of the scientists I know are men who have deep religious convictions and do not find that the theory of evolution or the explanation of natural phenomena by mechanistic means in any way infringes on their religion or religious beliefs. So the two-model approach dealing with things on an either-or basis, Gish again reiterates that you've either got to have things created by a creator or, as is his favorite expression, brought into being from hydrogen. From hydrogen to human, I think, would be the track that would follow. But there's a mixture of things here. You know, we never really dealt much with evolution tonight. We got into all kinds of what Darwin did and what Darwin didn't. Darwin never dealt with origins in this way. Darwin was not a subscriber to the Big Bang. Darwin did not have these kinds of thoughts in Origin of Species. And this thing has just enlarged and enlarged. In the testimony at the Arkansas trial that dealt with creationism and branded it a religious thesis, it was pointed out that we did not have these kinds of explanations involved in biological evolution. I think there are sufficient numbers of red herrings drawn across the track to keep us away from the concept of biological organization. I come back to what I started with. Three things. Organisms change through time. Mr. Gish has not answered that. Organisms are related, not according to Gish. And thirdly, organisms come to be distributed where they are because of various adaptations. Now, those are the basics of evolution. But tonight, we've talked about cosmology and 101 other points. And the thesis has been that what we're trying to do is present an attractive, alternative, scientific explanation to students. I have yet to hear that. I have yet to understand just what it is that creationists want to put into schools. What books, what curricula, what data, and I've unfortunately found that there's a great deal of silence on these particular points. A more positive presentation, perhaps, of what it is creationists want versus what it is they don't like might be very, very helpful to future planning for education and future planning for the scientific welfare of this country. Thank you.
We will have now a 5-minute rebuttal by Dr. Gish, followed by a 5-minute rebuttal by Dr. Mayer, and then we will have questions from the floor.
Dr. Mayer asked the question, what do we creationists really want? Well, I would suggest this, Dr. Mayer. You got $8 million to get a group together and write those BSCS textbooks. You give us about $500,000 and we'll revise them for you along the two-model approach, and then you'll know what we'd like to put into those textbooks. We'd do it for a lot less than $8 million. Now, he says, I have not presented any positive evidence for creation. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the absolute predictions we'd make on the basis of creation is the sudden appearance of animals and plants with no transitional forms, no ancestors. That is the evidence I presented. That is positive evidence for creation, ladies and gentlemen. Forget about evolution. I don't care whether anybody ever heard of the theory. If we as creationists would try to think about what would we expect to find in the fossil record if creation is true, what we do find is exactly what we would expect and predict. Now, I say that's positive evidence. The evidence from probability to thermodynamics is absolutely positive evidence for creation. Now, listen, it convinced two atheists, Sir Fred Hoyle and Wick Ramasinghe, and I know of many others, but these are two very prominent scientists. That scientific evidence was positive enough, was compelling enough that it forced them literally to accept this concept of creation. And that is what they are saying. Sir Fred Hoyle said life was created. He says this Big Bang theory of the universe cannot account for its origin. He says biological evolution is wrong. He has come out solidly on the creationist side. I said very plainly, he doesn't believe the Bible. He doesn't believe the book of Genesis, but he believes creation, you see. And that is positive evidence for creation. Now, Dr. Mayer says that thermodynamics does not move inexorably in one direction. Oh, yes, it does. As Dr. Asimov pointed out, the universe is constantly becoming less orderly, more random. It is inexorably moving in one direction, and it's exactly opposite to that required for an evolutionary origin of this universe. That evidence shows the universe could not have created itself naturally. That is positive evidence then for creation. Dr. Mayer says that evolution doesn't work by chance, that molecules are deterministic, preordained. Well, certainly hydrogen combines with oxygen to form water. But ladies and gentlemen, here's this one thing that does not happen. Amino acids do not decide that they ought to line up in a certain way so that they can make an enzyme or a hormone or hemoglobin or something like that. Oh, no, they don't. They line up in a random fashion. The origin of DNA and RNA and proteins and a living cell would be totally due to chance, absolutely totally due to chance. There was no life, there was no reproduction, there could be no natural selection. It had to be totally due to chance. And these things are not preordained to do that. If they were, then Dr. Mayer would have to say God did it, if they were preordained to do that. Now, Dr. Mayer talks about the dogmatic position of the creationists. Ladies and gentlemen, evolutionists dogmatically insist that evolution is a fact. Oh, you can challenge a particular phylogeny. You can challenge any particular mechanism. That's all right. But one thing you dare not challenge is, quote, the fact of evolution, unquote. That is held dogmatically by evolutionists. They refuse to give it up. It is part of their philosophy, their materialistic, mechanistic philosophy. Dr. Mayer has mentioned religion. May I point out that evolution is the basic dogma of atheism, agnosticism, and humanism. It is a basic dogma as expressed by the American Humanist Association that said that humanism is a non-theistic religion and evolution is their basic dogma. Oh yes, I know. We don't utilize the supernatural in science. I didn't. As a biochemist, I assumed what I saw happening today happened yesterday and will happen in the future. But that's our attempt to explain how things operate, not their origin. When you attempt to explain the origin of the universe and the origin of life, you cannot You dare not exclude the possibility of a supernatural origin. How can we do that? Do we all have to become atheists? No, ladies and gentlemen, we don't have to become atheists when we work on this matter of origins. We can assume that God created this universe. As a matter of fact, I say, on the basis of all the available evidence, the best statement that we can make today scientifically is still, in the beginning, God created. Thank you very much.
And now Dr. Mayer once more.
Well, Dwayne's given me a number of wonderful openings. I don't know which one to start with. But let's start with his one that indicates that evolution is the foundation of atheism, humanism, communism, fascism, imperialism, racism, laissez-faire capitalism, and a variety of cultic, ethnic, and so-called liberal religions. If he hasn't said all of that, Mr. Morris has. And this clearly states that creation is a religious doctrine, and I would take their word for that. But can you imagine if someone really believed that evolution was the basis on which atheism, communism, humanism, fascism, imperialism, and so on were based, that they could live in harmony with such a doctrine? If I believe, for example, what Mr. Morris states he believes, I would wish evolution expunged from the schools. And I believe that's exactly what Mr. Morris wishes as well. But he's astute enough to recognize the failure of past efforts to ban the teaching of evolution. So now we have first equal time and then all of the time. I think equal time and fair play is their nice initial plea. But I think that if the creationist leopard lies down with the evolutionary lamb, the lamb will not get up. Mr. Morris is as unkind to other religions as he is to science itself. And he speaks of, and I quote, all other atheistic, pantheistic, polytheistic religions are merely various forms of evolutionism. And only in Genesis 1:1, the foundation of all foundations, is there a statement of the creation of the universe itself. Without this foundation, true religion is impossible. Again, if Dr. Morris actually believes this, how can he ask for equal time and fair play with what he has characterized as a creature of Satan? Make no mistake about it, the ultimate goal is neither equal time nor fair play. And how do I know this? By the words of creationists themselves. In the Christian School Builder for April 1983, on pages 205 to 207, there's an article entitled Reviewing and Correcting Encyclopedias, written by Ray E. Martin. And in it, Mr. Martin gives specific instructions as to how school board members, pastoral committees, or burdened parents may vandalize public property that disagrees with their religious views. Here is how Mr. Martin instructs his shock troops to deal with the topic of evolution in encyclopedias, and I quote, this quote, cutting out the sections on evolution is practical if the portions removed are not thick enough to cause damage to the spine of the book as it is opened and closed in normal use. When sections needing correction are too thick, paste the pages together, being careful not to smear portions of the book not intended for correction. Where is the support for equal time and fair play in such actions? These acts stop just short of book burning and give lie to the contention that both evolution and anti-evolution should have equal access to the public mind. There are other examples. In New York City right now, there's a little play. It's called Dandelion, a show for children about evolution. It plays there through April 1st. Now, the gist of the program that was put on public radio was the harassment of the paper bag players for mounting this production. It was noted that Lincoln Center in New York suggested leaving out the word evolution in the subtitle. It was further noted that a planned series of performances in North Florida were canceled because of potential controversy concerning evolution. What we have here is a concerted anti-evolution effort which has proven attractive to the scientifically naive. The aim of anti-evolutionists is to expunge evolution from the vocabulary of the 20th century. The degree of success they have achieved is a tribute to their persistence in the face of reason, but a damning indictment of our ability to explicate the nature of science to a general public. Thank you.
All right, now for up to 45 minutes, I say that as a promise rather than a threat, an outside time limit. We will entertain questions from the floor. There are microphones available, so if you have questions, the questions will be directed alternately to Dr. Gish and Dr. Mayer. After the one to whom the question has been asked gives his answer, then the other one may give his answer or any comments that he wishes to give on that topic. Then the original debater can comment a little bit further, and we'll have to play it by ear after that point. Now, one request, let the debaters do the debating. Make your questions succinct, very quick. No long prologues or preambles. Get to the point as quickly as you can. We are ready for the first question for Dr. Gish. Anyone?
Sir?
Yes.
I have at home a volume by the name of Index Fossils of North America by Schremer and Schrock, Balcony. And my question is, would not an index fossil be an impossible thing to accomplish if evolution were true?
Dr. Gish.
I see if I understood your question. First of all, are you asking how could an index fossil be an index fossil if evolution were not true? Is that what you're saying? Is that your question?
My question is, how could you arrive at an index fossil if there was a continuous line of fossils and there was no specific species? It had to be a continuous line of subspecies and species in between. There wouldn't be one block, a geographical area, or a specific species.
Well, that question I think could be answered in two ways. First of all, from the progressive creationist view, there'd be no problem. He would essentially agree with the evolutionists that the thing did occur at a certain stage of time. What the progressive creationist says, of course, is there's no evidence that it evolved. There's no ancestor, there's no transitional form. The thing has appeared in a certain period of time, but it was created, it had not evolved. Those who would not accept the progressive creationist point of view point out, and this would be true in any case, that an index fossil is simply the fossil of a creature that's limited in its distribution. Its distribution horizontally, its distribution vertically. It has a limited distribution. Again, that does not necessarily say when that organism was on the earth or how it got here. It has a certain limited distribution, and therefore it can be used as a fossil to identify a certain kind of rock, whether you call that rock Cambrian, or whether you call it Silurian, or Ordovician, or something like that. It identifies a certain ecological zone a certain, perhaps geographical area, but mainly an ecological zone, and has really basically nothing necessarily to do with evolution. The people who actually first used index fossils, as a matter of fact, the people who constructed the geological column were creationists. The geological column, as a matter of fact, was intact and complete by 1840, 20 years before Darwin published his book. So if the geological column and that order is evidence for evolution, it is a remarkable thing that all of this was constructed by creationists.
Dr. Mayer.
Just one comment. Yes, it was constructed by creationists. All of the scientists of the first part of the 19th century were creationists. Toward the end of the 19th century, they became evolutionists. Mr. Gish made a great point of Wickramasinghe and Fred Hoyle transiting from atheism to creationism. Let me make the point of the creationists transiting from creationism to evolution.
Any further comment on that question, Dr. Gish?
No, it took about 50, 60, 70 years of steady indoctrination before this did take place. And that's the problem in our schools today. Our young people are literally being brainwashed. Now, that's obviously what Dr. Mayer suggests and what he wants to perpetuate. He wants your young people to be brainwashed, to be taught only evolution. Now, he's criticizing us creationists. He says you creationists really want to get evolution out and teach creation only. Well, ladies and gentlemen, he wants to keep creation out and teach evolution only. It's not true. We don't want to expunge evolution from the textbooks. We just want all the evidence presented fairly and thoroughly.
All right, we're ready for a question directed to Dr. Mayer.
I have one right here. Dr. Mayer, if we're talking about both views, if they're based only on the evidences and the observations, what's left, not on the mechanisms themselves, because we can't see creation and there's no evidence of macro evolution, why would we not consider them both in the same light, like both as models or both as theories? Why should one be scientific and the other not be, in your estimation?
Well, I think the rationale is the same as if somebody came to me in a mathematics course and said, why not teach students that 2 and 2 are 5? What Mr. Gish has presented tonight is simply not validated within the scientific community. It's the opinion of Mr. Gish and a very small group of adherents of his. And it has been considered in the scientific community. As I said earlier, if someone could actually prove what Mr. Gish's contentions have been, those people would be not in Evansville, they'd be in Stockholm receiving Nobel Prizes. Now, you've either got to assume that there is some great cabal, some great scientific wall designed specifically to eliminate these kinds of representations, or that they simply don't stand the test of science. And I don't see any point in muddying up a student's thought with unsubstantiated and in many cases simply erroneous scientific interpretations.
Dr. Gish.
Ladies and gentlemen, you see Dr. Mayer's use of this term scientific community. He only includes evolutionists in the scientific community. The creationists are automatically excluded out. Then obviously there are no creationists in the scientific community. You see, that's arrogance. That's extreme arrogance, and that's what evolutionists do. Notice all night long he's been referring to me as an anti-evolutionist, not a creationist. And the evolutionists, they refer to themselves as scientists. They refer to us as anti-creationists, or I mean anti-evolutionists. You see, that's arrogance. Of course we're not included in the community of scientists when they're defined in that way. Now, I don't want to teach 2 + 2 = 5. That's ridiculous. But I don't want, unchallenged, to my children and your children and my grandchildren, that hydrogen plus hydrogen plus hydrogen equals people. I don't want that taught either, because that's totally unscientific.
We would remind you that at the onset, you were not to show your pleasure or displeasure with a speech or a point by applauding at any time other than after a speaker has spoken. Please observe that. The audience has been extremely courteous, extremely polite this evening. It's been a very easy chore for me, and I would like very much for it to continue to be. Dr. Mayer, do you have a response to that last question, or Dr. Gish's response?
I like the sound of hydrogen plus hydrogen plus hydrogen equals people, and I'd like Dr. Gish sometime to show me where in the scientific literature that occurs, because I've never seen it.
I'd be glad to do that.
Okay. Now, a question for Dr. Gish.
Dr. Gish, you mentioned fossils in the Cambrian age springing up without antecedents some 600 million years ago. Is it accurate that you agree that there are some animals over 600 million years old?
The question is really, as I understand it, do I really believe that there are some animals 600 million years or older?
Yes.
Or older than 600 million years? Yes. As a matter of fact, I don't. But regardless of the age, you see, whether those Cambrian animals appeared 600 million years ago, whether they appeared 6,000 or 10,000 or 6 million years ago, if they came about mechanistically, naturally, and gradually from some evolutionary predecessors, we must find the fossils of those evolutionary ancestors. That must be true. That is what we do not find. We do not find those transitional forms. We have fossils, alleged fossils of microscopic bacteria and algae. We have the fossils of these very, very complex invertebrates. We have never found a transitional form. Now, how can that be, you see? Now, that's my point. Wherever or whenever these things appeared, whether it was 600 million years ago or 6,000 years ago or 6 million years ago, they appear fully formed right from the start.
Dr. Mayer.
Well, Dwayne has made a number of statements about sudden appearance of organisms. They appear suddenly, and then he states just recently that time is inconsequential. Time is of the essence, because one thing you do find, if there are organisms that appear suddenly, they appear at vastly different times. They don't all appear at once. There is no early stratum with fully formed vertebrates and invertebrates and complex organisms and simple organisms all appearing at one time. There is a layered progression of complexity. And I don't think that ignoring the time factor is helpful in explaining this sequence of appearances.
Further comment, Dr.
Yes.
Gish?
We could arrange a buggy, a Model T Ford, a Model A Ford, a V8 Ford, and a modern day Ford in a true time sequence. Now, we know that the buggy came first. We know that the Model T came later, and then the Model A and the V8 and so forth. We know that. But that doesn't prove, does it, that the buggy evolved into a Model A Ford, and the Model A Ford evolved into the V8, and the V8 into the modern Ford? Not at all. They were each specially created. They appeared, you see, as a result of direct activity of an intelligent being. And the fact that these creatures, wherever you want to believe they appeared, or whenever it was, yet they appeared fully formed. And that could not be true if evolution is true.
Right. A question now for Dr. Mayer, over here.
Okay, this has been brought up several times. Dr. Mayer, I haven't heard any kind of positive evidence for transitional fossils. Okay, this has been brought up, I guess, 3 times now. Can you provide some specific piece of evidence that shows how this animal gets from this point to another point, or from that matter, how the human being came from one point to the point where it is now? Do you have any specific examples? We haven't heard any.
Well, there are lots of transitional forms. As I said earlier, Dr. Gish simply refuses to recognize them. Archaeopteryx is an excellent transition form between reptiles and birds. There are excellent transition forms between reptiles and mammals. There are excellent transition forms between fish and amphibia. There are, if you go into the National Museum in Washington, D.C., and look up a man by the name of Porter Keir, who is the curator of the paleontological collections there, he'll be delighted to show you these that exist. There are a great numbers. I take no stock in this, no transitional forms. It's one of these things, if you have a gap this big, and they say, well, now there's a gap here, you find the thing in the middle, and they say, oh, well, now it's worse. There are 2 gaps. There's a gap between this one and this one and this one and this one. And then you fill in, and this is the kind of reason and logic that appears here. You're never going to fill in the gaps if for every one you fill in, you create 2. But believe me, there are transitional forms and of very high quality and agreed upon position.
Well, if that's true, Dr. Mayer, I wished you'd write to Dr. Colin Patterson, British Museum. Tell that poor fellow about that. He's very much mixed up on this, although he is an expert on the fossil record. He has that great collection of fossils available. I wish you'd write to David Kitts, who got his training under George Gaylord Simpson. Tell that poor fellow down there that he's absolutely wrong when he says that the fossil record doesn't produce these transition forms. I wish you'd tell these people, because these are experts in the field that have been candid enough to admit the true nature of that fossil record. Archaeopteryx is not a transitional form. As a matter of fact, and I know that you probably accuse me of quoting out of context, this Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge, in an article published in Paleobiology, Volume 3, 1977, on page 147, they say that, and I quote now, and you just take it, I'll let you disinterpret it, at the higher level of evolutionary transition between basic morphological designs, gradualism has always been in trouble, though it remains the official position of most Western evolutionists. Smooth intermediates between Bauplana, the German word Bauplana means these basic morphological designs. Smooth intermediates between Bauplana are almost impossible to construct, even in thought experiments. There is certainly no evidence for them in the fossil record. Parenthesis. Curious mosaics like Archaeopteryx do not count. Parenthesis. End of quote.
Dr. Mayer.
I'd have to see that quote because I tell you, Jay has never told that to me when we've had these discussions.
Now, these people are evolutionists. I don't want to be accused of distorting or misconstruing. I say frankly, Stephen Jay Gould, Niles Eldredge are evolutionists. They believe in evolution, but they have stated some facts, and we can use those facts. The facts that they have stated, how they interpret those facts may be something very different than the way I interpret it, but that's the fact.
Any additional remarks on that question? All right. Is yours a question that can be directed first to Dr. Gish, or do you want to wait? Okay. A question for Dr. Gish. Okay. There's someone down here.
Yes, Dr. Gish. I understand that the paleontologists have gotten together within the last year or so, and that they have decided that the graduated transition theory is basically not as valid as they had believed and hoped for, and that they have come up with something called punctuated equilibrium.
Yes.
Okay. I was wondering if you can expound on that a little bit, please.
Okay. Now, the comment is this, is that the evolutionists now many of them, including Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldridge, are saying that this idea of slow and gradual evolution is not true. Now, that was the dogma for the past 100 years. This idea that evolution was slow and gradual, that's what everybody said it was, and that's what they tried to support. They were looking for the transitional form. Now they can't find the transitional form. So they are saying evolution was not slow and gradual. It must have been very jerky. It went very rapidly. For example, they say a species pops into the fossil record. Suddenly, here it is, fully formed. Sticks around for 2 or 3, 5, 10 million years. Then it pops out of existence, and another species just pops into existence. No transitional forms. Now that's, you see, that's contrary to Darwinian evolution, slow gradual change. Now they're saying, obviously, evolution did not occur slowly and gradually, so, just as obviously, it must have occurred very rapidly. Now, what is the evidence for that? Absence of transitional form. That is the only evidence. Now, furthermore, this punctuated equilibrium idea, this idea that evolution occurred very rapidly, does not even address the serious problem. Their idea of punctuated equilibrium is try to explain why we have no transitional forms between species. That's not the serious problem. The serious problem is these huge gaps between the microscopic single-cell organism and complex invertebrates, between complex invertebrates and fishes, between fish and amphibia, between reptile and bird, these big gaps, the gap between phyla, classes, orders, and families. There is the problem. And this, they don't even try to address that problem. And so it's not a mechanism. It doesn't even try to solve the problem. It's just a scenario based upon the fact that we don't find transitional forms. And that is the evidence for creation.
Dr. Mayer.
Well, first of all, let me comment. You said that a group of paleontologists have gotten together. Paleontologists, unlike politicians, don't caucus. The work of Gould and Eldridge and a few others dealing with this concept of punctuated equilibrium, which I think Dwayne has explained adequately, is a thesis that is being incorporated within the mechanistic body of evolutionary knowledge. Neither Gould nor Eldridge deny natural selection, and neither are so focused on punctuated equilibrium that they say that that's the only way things can happen. I predict confidently a synthesis of the Darwinian natural selection and the Gould punctuated equilibrium. And when it's all synthesized, it still ends up at the same point. Organisms are related, organisms change through time, and organisms are distributed on the earth according to their adaptive patterns.
Further comment?
Well, what these people come up with, just a new scenario. They haven't come up with a mechanism. They can't explain why an organism would change rapidly, how it changed rapidly. They just say, look, there's no evidence for gradual evolution, so evolution must have been very rapid. Now, Stephen Stanley at Johns Hopkins University, Ed Wiley at KU, people like that, both evolutionists, they are saying, and I can quote their literature, in which they said that natural selection apparently had little to do with the general overall scheme of evolution. It was of minor importance. And as a matter of fact, Ed Wiley says that natural selection just weeds out things. And so, yes, they are very definitely de-emphasizing the importance of natural selection in these new evolutionary schemes.
Okay, we have a question down here for Dr. Gish. For Dr. Mayer, excuse me.
Dr. Mayer, in respect to the formation of complex organic molecules, for instance, ribonuclease, you said that you cannot take these, put them in a jar, shake them together, and expect formation. Am I correct in that aspect?
That's what I said.
Okay, you said that you can do this in a lab now by the influence of an outside source, such as a scientist. Now, is this not a contradiction of your beliefs, that you say that you can't just put things together and they form, yet it would appear to me that you believe that billions of years ago we had a primordial soup of just different compounds just happened to form? Is that not the same thing as putting them together in a jar and shake them? because
No.
you say there's no outside influence.
No, I think you want to go back to the Miller-Urey experiment, where they did put very basic things such as methane and ammonia and so on into a temperature and energy controlled situation, and these did indeed form organic molecules. Wasn't putting them in a jar and shaking them. It was setting up a very complex experiment. And what they did show was that this formation of organic molecules did occur. It's the same thing we had years ago when people believed there was no connection between organic and inorganic chemistry until Wohler synthesized urea from inorganic components. When he did that, then we recognized that organic chemistry and inorganic chemistry were not so separate.
Okay, my question is, though, okay, we have Stanley K. Miller, I believe, what, the 50s, was the one that was the outside influence when he put the simulated lightning, the simulated ultraviolet light, the simulated temperature conditions in his lab. Who was the outside source when the primordial soup formed, quote unquote, the first living organism? Who was the outside influence in that case?
Did there have to be an outside influence? Are you postulating one?
That's what it would seem that you would say, because when I posed the question, you said, well, wait, Stanley K. Miller and his associate were the outside influence in this case. You said that you just can't put things together and expect them to happen unless you have an outside influence. You know, I do organic research. I can't just put two things in a flask and expect them to do anything unless I control the exact conditions. Now, I agree with that. My point is, who formed the conditions during the primordial soup? Who controlled the conditions during the primordial soup? Who gave us the ultraviolet light, the lightning, the heat, things such as that? Who is the author of these things?
Well, if you're putting it that way, science is moot on that point. Science does not postulate an author. That's for theology to do.
Let me address that problem. The outside influence, Stanley Miller, let me tell you what he did. How he imposed upon that apparatus some conditions that could never have existed on the hypothetical primordial Earth. What he did, he put these gases, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen, and water vapor. By the way, the Earth never had any methane, ammonia atmosphere. We know that now. Science has shown that, but they still don't pay any attention to the science. As long as you're having fun, who cares? Well, they put these gases in the apparatus. He put these gases in the apparatus, circulated through an electrical discharge chamber, which was the energy. The moment it passed through the electrical discharge chamber and a minute quantity of product was formed, it was immediately isolated in a trap. He had a condenser, which caused the water vapor to condense and the products ran down into the trap. The gases continued to circulate, but the products were isolated, removed. Now, that was very important to the success of this experiment, which was extremely trivial in the first place. All he got was a few amino acids. That's light years short of getting life, just a few building blocks. But even that trivial result would never have been possible if he had not imposed that trap. Now, why? Because if those amino acids had been exposed to the electrical discharge, the energy that formed them, the rates of destruction are vastly in excess of their rate of formation. The rate of destruction of these products are millions and billions to one compared to their rate of formation. Stanley Miller would never have got a detectable quantity of amino acids if he had not imposed that trap on the apparatus. Now, 2 points about the trap. First of all, there were no organic chemists on the hypothetical primordial Earth to provide the trap, which you are referring to. Secondly, even if there were a trap available, we've never been able to dream up a trap. We have never been able to conceive what on the hypothetical primordial Earth would have served as a trap. The ocean would not have served as a trap. And most of that stuff would be destroyed before it ever reached the ocean, and there in the ocean the rates of destruction vastly exceed the rate at which stuff could reach the ocean. The ocean is not a trap. But supposing that one could think of a trap, eventually, a trap that would trap those amino acids and preserve them from destruction, that is fatal to any theory on the origin of life. If you isolate those amino acids in a trap, which Miller did, what happens next? Nothing. They just sit there. That's all. Why? Because there's no energy available. You see, to combine those amino acids to form a protein, you have to feed an enormous quantity of energy into those chemical bonds. But you don't have any energy. You don't have any energy. You've isolated those products in a trap to preserve them from destruction. So you have no energy. That's the end. That's the end of the road. You're not going to go any further. But supposing later you bring in energy, what are you going to do? You're going to destroy those amino acids at billions of times faster than they'd ever combine to form a protein. The evolutionist is caught between the horns of a dilemma. With energy, he's dead. Without energy, he's dead. In any case, he's just dead. That's all. There's no way you're ever going to get any significant quantity under any plausible primitive Earth condition. The Stanley Miller experiment was nothing more than an exercise in organic chemistry.
Does the dead have a response?
Well, as a voice from beyond the grave, I can speak to Gish that he is a voice crying in the wilderness.
I have a question for...
It would have to go to Dr. Gish. The next question should.
Okay.
Now, is yours for him or Dr. Mayer?
Dr. Mayer.
Okay, for Dr. Gish.
I have two short questions for you, Dr. Gish. Now, God is perfect, and he created a perfect earth. And he must have created perfect organisms, and therefore the dinosaurs, the various dozens of dinosaurs. Why did they all, if they were perfectly created, die off? That's number one question. Number two, you mentioned earlier that science is mute on the postulation of how the initial cosmic egg came into existence. Where did it come from? Who made it? Okay, so from that you jump to, well, somebody must have made it, and therefore there is God. Okay, I ask you, where did God come from? And how did he come to be? I think they are equivalent questions. You're only jumping the point.
Do you have the sense of the question?
Take the second question, repeat that for me, and I'll answer that, and then go back. Can you repeat it? Did you get the question?
Well, I think that the second question is, where did God come from? And the first is,
let me answer that question.
Why did the perfect
What I'm saying is,
die?
it's true that science can explain where the Big Bang, what happened before the Big Bang, and the cosmic shell. Yes.
Right.
Okay, that's true. You cannot explain that. But then, can you explain God? Isn't God just as much a postulate as the Big Bang?
All right. You want me to answer the question, where did God come from? Who created God? Is that your question?
Well, in reference to the Big Bang.
Is that your question, yes or no?
Right.
Okay. Now, let me first of all just turn that question around. Let us suppose that there is no God. The only reality is the materialistic universe. Where did matter come from?
That's what I'm saying. Science is mute on that.
You see, logically, the only answer you can give is it had to exist forever. If you're going to go by natural laws, the first law of thermodynamics says the total quantity of energy and matter in the universe is a constant. You can't get something from nothing. Therefore, if you're sticking by a strictly mechanistic explanation, you have to say that matter existed forever. That can't be. The universe is running down. It could not have been here forever, because if it had been here forever, it would have run down a long time ago. It hasn't run down yet. Now, let me go on. So, you cannot believe that matter has been here forever. What's the only other possibility? You see, our ultimate source, whatever that is, whether it's just matter or whether it's God, it had to exist forever. I am saying God has always existed. There was never a time when he did not exist and then he came into existence. You have to believe either in eternal matter or eternal God, one or the other. That has to be true. And I say the only possible explanation is that God has existed forever. Matter could not have existed forever. As a matter of fact, they're showing that the proton actually decays, takes an enormous of a length of time, but that means things are not eternal.
Okay. Could you rephrase the first question,
about
please?
Dinosaurs?
Okay, yeah, the first question is more straightforward. If God is perfect and he created
why did they become extinct?
Yes, if he created...
Why, if God created these things, why have they become extinct?
Yes, since he's a perfect creator.
Yeah, okay. Now you have to realize that's a theological question. You're asking a why question. That's a theological question. Science doesn't deal with questions like that. I can give you my answer. I'd give you a theological answer. As I suggested early in this debate, that it's possible that since creation, something has happened to change the original created state. And I believe it has. I believe something has happened to disrupt the initial created state. And that has led to these deteriorative processes. It's led to the second law of thermodynamics. It has led to this deterioration, the downward process, which then eventually results in extinctions and catastrophes and so forth and so.
Question: if God is perfect, he should have known the entire future, and therefore he should be able to predict.
I would
the
like
future
to
also.
intrude. I think that we're getting the argument between the floor and the debaters rather than with the debaters. Dr. Mayer, do you have a response to that exchange?
Not particularly. I think what you have is two separate types of epistemologic systems coming together. Dwayne points up quite correctly that what you're asking is not going to be resolved within the framework of science. And tonight I understood, although we haven't really kept to it very well, that we were going to deal solely with scientific evidences. When you begin arguing theology versus science, you're in an entirely different and I think non-profitable realm. One may argue science versus science, or theologic belief versus theologic belief, which is done very frequently. But when you get them mixed up, I think you're contributing nothing to either.
I would agree. I would agree. Science versus science, or theology versus theology.
All right. A question now for Dr. Mayer.
Not going back 6,000 years or 6 million years, going back maybe 30 seconds, isn't creation happening 50 times a minute? Science cannot, no matter if they put all of the atoms that a sperm is made up of and an egg is made up, if they would put all of those together, they could not create life. No matter what they did, no matter what they could not breathe life into that. Isn't creation happening every time that a newborn baby is conceived and it grows into a life? Isn't that creation happening all the time?
Well, this is a problem of definition of creation. But what you're getting there is life from life. You're getting a living organism giving rise to other living organisms. And if you wish to regard each new life as a separate creation, I think that's a reasonable way of looking at it. But I don't think it's what we've been talking about this evening.
I would agree with that. The fact is, in the laws of biogenesis, the empirically established laws of science is that life comes only from pre-existing life, and like only or always produces like. And so those are two laws of biology. If we're going to deal with the science of biology, then that throws out spontaneous generation of life, and it throws out evolution. Now, you want to talk about empirically observed scientific facts. Those are two of those empirically observed facts. Life comes only from pre-existing life, and an organism always produces a similar organism.
Well, that's a little simplistic, that life only comes. In the main, that is correct, but it's like everything else. It's like all laws, there are exceptions. We have cases of like not producing like, for example. And we may have situations where things come from non-living things. But those are exceptions. The major rule is still correct.
Well, I would certainly like to hear about those exceptions, Dr. Mayer. If you know where inanimate matter has given rise to life, I'd like to hear about it. And if you know where an organism has produced something that is basically different, I would like to hear about that too. As far as I know, humans always produce humans, and cats always produce cats, and dogs always produce dogs. I've never seen a dog or a cat produce a dat, for example, a mixture of a cat and a dog?
Well, as a matter of fact, Dwayne, you've got to remember we've bred lions and tigers and gotten ligers and tigrons, if that's any help to you.
If life produces life, then why can't you take a live sperm and a live egg and produce life on your own?
Well, in theory, that's exactly what a test tube baby is.
Oh no. You start with the sperm from the father and the egg from the mother, and you combine those two.
That's what I
That's the only thing that happens in the test tube is that
I thought
active
that's what you were
fertilization.
saying.
No, life hasn't come out of a test tube. You have mixed the two in the test tube, but life has not come from a test tube. You said life comes from life.
I think both debaters have responded to your question adequately. We have to give a chance to someone else, and it's Dr. Gish's turn. Do you have a question for Dr. Gish?
Dr. Gish, you pointed out earlier that there have been very few fossils found representing ancestors of the higher plants, the flowering plants, although I understand recently some have been found. Could you explain why the most advanced of the plants, namely the flowering plants, appear only in the more recent sediments of the geologic column, as opposed to being present throughout the geologic column, which is what the creationist model, I would think, would suggest?
Well, first of all, I'll give you two explanations. In a minute, I'm going to show you that they don't really do that. But if they do that, as you suggest, then again, there's two possible explanations. There's the progressive creationist view, and there is the ecological zone view. So there's two possible explanations. Now, the thing is that this is the important thing. Those plants appear suddenly fully formed. When I say suddenly, what I mean is that when you first see them, they are completely formed. The flowering plants, for example, there's 43 families of flowering plants, and they appear abruptly on this planet. And you cannot go back and trace some evolutionary series back to, say, a seed-bearing plant, the gymnosperm. You can't do that. They appear suddenly. Now, furthermore, in early Cambrian rocks, it's well documented they have evidence for the existence of vascular plants, actually some evidence of woody plants. This evidence was published in the journal Evolution in 1956 and in 1959. In 1956 by Leclerc, and in 1959 by Daniel Axelrod. And Axelrod, for example, cited numerous workers in the Baltic, in India, in Germany, and other places where they had actually documented the existence of vascular plants in the Cambrian. And that's supposed to be about 200 million years before the vascular plants ever made the transition from water to land, or any kind of plant, you see.
Okay, but why would they appear primarily in the upper layer instead of throughout the column?
All right, let me give you the answer that Axelrod gave. He said that these vascular plants were actually in existence in the early Cambrian times. The reason we don't ordinarily find their fossils, the macrofossils of these things, in the early Cambrian rocks, because he said that when these Cambrian rocks were laid down, only the material at the lower levels were being eroded and deposited. These vascular plants were actually in existence, but they were in the uplands area, and they were not being fossilized. Now, that's an ecological zone explanation. Now, again, I'll go back to our explanation. There's two possible explanations to account for this, what we say, general order, general sequence, that we usually see, although we don't always see that, as Axelrod has pointed out, is either on the basis of progressive creation or on the basis of the fact that these plants did live in different areas. Now, obviously, you go to the 15,000-foot level in the mountains, you don't find the same plants that you find in the tropics or here in Indiana. You find a different flora at different areas. So that is another possible explanation for this appearance in that way, that it was a matter of ecological zoning. So there's just two possible explanations. But again, I emphasize the fact that they have appeared abruptly, fully formed. And that, I think, is the evidence
that it's a real critical evidence.
Dr. Mayer.
Just two comments. Vascular plants may have some vestigial remnants early, but they were not the flowering plants. Secondly, Dwayne has several times mentioned progressive creations. I'd simply like to know, how many creations were there?
How many creationists are there?
Not people. How many creations? You have mentioned creations, progressive creations. This group appearing here, fully formed, that group appearing there, fully formed, etc. How many of those stages would there have been?
Let me tell you what the progressive creationist would say. He would say that God created the earth, possibly 4.5, 5 billion years ago. Then God created microscopic forms of life. Subsequently, about 600 million years ago, God created these complex invertebrates which do appear suddenly fully formed with no trace of an ancestor. Then they would say that God created fishes 100 million years later or so, whatever, and that God created amphibians maybe 30 or 40 million years later, and then reptiles and mammals, primates, and eventually man, perhaps several 100,000 years ago. Now, if you want to get the real lowdown on it, you'll have to go talk to a progressive creationist and see what he has to say about it. But they do suggest something similar to that. But what these people are saying is what we are saying. Again, you just can't say it enough. Those things appear right from the start, fully formed. Fishes are fishes right from the start, Dr. Mayer, and you know that you cannot produce one single transitional form between an invertebrate and a fish. Now, you know that. And if you had 100 million years of evolution, you ought to have those things just laying all over the place.
Our 45 minutes have expired. So if you are on your way to a mic, maybe you want to save your question for someone later on. Thank you very, very much for coming. Okay.